Thank you all for coming tonight to the Grants Lecture Series. It's just a delight to see so many people here. Our featured speaker is Dr. Mary Jo Carnot. She is the newly appointed Assistant Director of Faculty and Learning. Prior to that, she was part of the Counseling, Social Work, and Psychology Faculty Department. She earned her PhD from Ohio State, and the title of her talk is How Learning Works, 7 Research-Based Principles of Learning. Please join me in a welcome for Dr. Mary Jo Carnot.
Thank you all for being here. Most of you know that I probably would be avoiding this spot if I could. So I'm just going to say I'm welcome and I'm happy to see you all here. Before we get started, I want to kind of put this in a context. The talk is actually taken from a book that was written primarily for teachers and for faculty, but it applies to learning in everyday life as well. And so what I want to do is say that we can think about this as not just something that has classroom implications, but something that can be applied to learning everywhere. And I want to start out, and I probably do not have enough handouts, so what I'm going to ask you to do is to share between probably two or three people. Wasn't anticipating quite this many people here. What I want you to do is to start to think about some of the questions that are on the sheet that's coming around, and specifically to start to think about what a definition of learning is. And that's kind of our first step here, is to think about what learning is and what it means. We've got a variety of people here, from students to faculty to community members who probably have been students at one point in their lives, to deans and other assorted people. So we might have some different ideas about what learning is. And as a starting point, what I want you to do is to think about how we would define learning as a group. And you can use your note card to write that down if you want. And we'll talk about some of those definitions.
There's a seat right here. Have a seat.
I'm going to get fair skin in here. So we've been thinking about it a little bit. And what are some things that come to your mind when you think about learning? I probably didn't wait long enough for all of you. Most of the time they say you have to give people a couple of minutes to think about that. But how would you define learning? How would you determine whether learning had occurred? What are the big things that you want to look for? Any ideas? I'm going to start calling on people by color of card if I have to, but I hope I don't have to.
Memory.
Memory. Okay, so memory is maybe one indication that learning has occurred. Okay.
Progress.
Progress. Okay.
An aha moment.
An aha moment. Okay, that's good.
Being able to explain it to others.
Being able to explain it to others.
We
And-
learn how to speak and walk and ride a bicycle. That's learning.
Okay, yes, those are all things that you've learned in your lifetime. Speaking, walking, riding a bicycle. Other things you can think about?
Neurotransmitters get released.
Neurotransmitters, so you're talking about brain activity associated with learning.
Making mistakes.
Making mistakes is associated with learning. Any other things you can think about?
Observation.
Observation. Explain that a little bit. That's one way you might learn.
Yeah, you just by observing somebody doing something, you can visually see that, and you can try that and learn that way.
Okay. All right. I think we're kind of getting into not only what a definition of learning is, but also some ways that we might learn, some things that we have learned. So I'm going to kind of take us back to that definition of what learning is. And specifically, if I'm talking from a psychology point of view, usually what psychology thinks about learning as is a change that occurs in either behavior or thinking that occurs as a result of experiences that you've had. So some changes are not considered to be learning, some changes are. It has to do with the experiences that you've had. And those experiences, one of the things that we'll be concerned with is to think about the kinds of experiences that most effectively lead to learning, and some things that can help us to make those processes work just a little bit better. Okay? So if we look at that definition of learning, essentially what we're saying is that it's a change, again, that occurs in your behavior, in your thinking, that occurs as a result of experience. We talked about some ways in which we might tell that it's occurred. How do you normally measure your learning? What do you think about when you try to determine whether or not you've learned something? Do you have some processes that you might use to assess whether you've learned something or maybe whether someone else has learned something? I know that students take tests. That's one way, right?
If you've reached a set goal.
If you've reached a goal, like what kind of goal do you mean?
Well, you can learn like affectively, cognitively, or physically. So whatever goal you set for each or an individual category.
Okay, so some goal that you've set for yourself, it might be a cognitive goal. I've memorized this many vocabulary terms, or I've achieved some sort of physical goal for myself in terms of maybe some sort of physical capability that I'm trying to learn. Okay, that's good. Any other ways that you can think about?
Can you demonstrate it or explain it to somebody else?
Okay, so demonstrating it or explaining it to someone else, that's kind of a retrieval and an explanation sort of skill. Other ways you might think about how you might determine whether learning has occurred?
One of the things would be like if you can replicate, if you can repeat the thing. But I was also wondering, in your definition though, would you like to include not just only change, but also reinforce? Like, you know, sometimes learning is not change, it might reinforce what you already know.
Okay, so basically you're building on your prior knowledge, you're reinforcing things that you've already learned. And that's an important step that we're going to be moving towards. So that actually helps a little bit. Because yes, in some ways what you're doing is you're always kind of increasing your knowledge. You might have known something about learning before you came. Hopefully in this session tonight, you'll add something to what you know about learning, some sort of change. And you're still talking about change, but it's maybe a progressive change as opposed to an absolute change, in a sense. We could talk about that in terms of changes in neurotransmitters too, if we wanted to look at it biologically. One of the aspects that people have looked at is to think about when you learn something, you're always building on what you've learned before. And sometimes what happened before can either help your learning or it can make your learning more difficult. So can you think of a situation where you learned something and knowing something before you came in helped you to learn that new thing? Anyone have an example that they can think about?
I'll get one for my students. When you review your notes right before coming to class, it helps you to learn the new stuff better.
Okay, so what Anne is telling me is that when her students look at the previous day's notes, what happens is that they're much more able to process what's going on in that new session and able to learn it better. That's a great example. Anyone think of another example?
Any sort of math class, like you would need prior knowledge in order to do a more difficult math. So
that's great.
So things build on each other from learning.
Okay. Normally, that's a good thing. That normally, if you have prior knowledge, you can extend it. You can make it deeper. You can make it richer. You can make it more meaningful. Sometimes, though, having prior knowledge actually hurts your learning new information. An example, I want you to look at the true or false questions that are on the front of the handout that I gave you. Did you try to answer those questions?
Bubbles in boiling water consist primarily of air. A force is needed to change the motion of an object, and an astronaut is standing on the moon with a baseball in his or her hands. When the baseball is released, it will fall to the moon's surface.
What would you say about those questions? And Anne just read them, but I'll read them again just so that they can be heard in the recording, and I'll ask you all to kind of tell me what you think. The bubbles in boiling water consist primarily of air. Yes or no?
Should we make them raise their hands?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
If you think it's true, raise your hand.
If you think it's false, raise your hand. If you think I'm trying to trick you, raise your hand. Okay. You're right. This one actually is false. Okay. But you would think that it was true just based on your prior knowledge of what bubbles are, right? Okay. What about the second one? True? False?
Read it again.
Okay, I have to read it. You're right. I'm being taped. I can't see it. That's the real problem. A force is needed to change the motion of an object. True? False? True. Most people are going to say that one is true. That one, okay. How about the next one? Okay, an astronaut is standing on the moon with a baseball, and when he drops the baseball, it will fall to the moon surface.
True. Pretty much.
What do you think? True? False? True? Okay. You guys know I'm trying to trick you. Okay. All right. But if you had seen pictures of people floating on the moon, you might think that that was indeed false. So this is a case where your prior knowledge might actually hurt how you were able to process that problem. And if you were trying to learn new concepts in science, you might have a difficult time trying to learn those concepts because of that prior knowledge. Okay? So that's an example of how prior knowledge might both help what your learning is, but might also hurt it if you have preconceptions that prevent you from learning new things. Okay. The next kind of question I want to ask you has to do with things that, ways in which you might organize knowledge, okay? And what I want you to do is to think about a topic that you maybe know quite a bit about, and try to think about everything that you know about that topic, okay? And then I want you to think about a topic that maybe you don't know so much about, okay? And I'm just going to pull an example out of the air. Look at automobile mechanics, okay? I know very little about automobile mechanics. Okay. If you're thinking about those two separate topics, how would you describe what your knowledge is like across those two topics? If you look at the thing that you know a lot about, the topic that you know lots about, what would you be able to say about that knowledge? Does it seem like you can easily generate a lot of things and that those things are very interconnected with each other when you compare it to something like that you don't know so much about? So for example, auto mechanics, I can say it has an engine, it has a transmission. That's about all I can say, right? But if you're talking to me about something that I know, I have a much deeper, richer structure that's more interconnected. It might be hierarchical. So we can talk about how knowledge structures are different between things that we might be more of an expert in and things that we just don't know very well, okay? And we can take that further and we can think about what we do when we learn things. If I'm starting out learning, I'm probably really just building basic conceptual connections. The car has an engine. The engine uses gas to run. That's about where I am when I talk about auto mechanics. I might be a little bit further than that, but not much, okay? So I have these very simple conceptual connections. But if I had a deeper knowledge of that, then I could try to make connections across hierarchies and across sequences of facts. Okay, so I'm trying to think of an example that we might all be able to relate to. And one example that I thought about in the last few days when I was thinking about this is thinking about wildfires. Most of us know just what we've heard on the news, but somebody who's involved in fighting wildfires would know the different types of fires, would know the best ways to stop those fires, would know the best types of equipment to use, and would be able to very quickly pull all those pieces of information together to deal with the situation, which those of us who are not experts wouldn't be able to do. I might be able to pull pieces of knowledge. I know that weather's a factor. I know that wind's a factor. I know that there are certain retardants they can use. But that's about all I can do, okay? Because I'm not an expert. If I'm trying to learn something new, then what I need to do is to think about how to build those connections. There are certain types of fires. Are there different methods that work best with those different types? Those are the kind of connections I need to make, not just the very simple conceptual facts. So that principle of learning has to do with how we organize knowledge. We have to try to build those really rich, deep connections as opposed to just learning simple facts. If I'm just trying to learn vocabulary terms, then I'm not going to get very far because I'm not building any connections between things. That's just not where it's going, okay? All right, so I've looked at sort of two principles. One had to do with the role of prior knowledge. One had to do with how knowledge is organized. The next major principle that I want to think about has to do with motivation for learning. I want to think about this in terms of thinking about the last thing that you learned how to do and what motivated you to do that learning. From a student perspective, what's your motivation? We have a lot of students in the room, so we can look at that perspective pretty easily. What motivates your learning?
Money.
I'm sorry?
Money.
Money, okay. Okay, so you're motivated by money. You're motivated maybe by getting a good grade. You're motivated maybe if you think it's going to help you get a job later on, right? So you want to see kind of that connection to some real life external kind of reward, okay? Any other kinds of motivations that you want to think about? Go ahead.
To develop like inquisitiveness, like have a well-rounded mind.
Okay, so to develop inquisitiveness, to have a well-rounded mind, that's one thing you might want to do. That's more of an internal sort of motivation. Any other kinds of motivations? Success. How do you define success?
Every person has their own definition.
Okay, so every person has their own definition of what success means.
Achieving your goals.
Achieving goals, so it's you're setting some sort of goal for yourself. Okay, any other kinds of things?
Not failing.
Not failing, okay, that's a motivation, okay.
Interest in the subject.
Interest in the subject is definitely something that would be a motivation. Other kinds of things?
It's fun.
It's fun, okay.
Survival.
I'm sorry?
Survival.
Survival, and that's, yeah. You'd learn pretty quick if your survival depended on it, or you wouldn't. What else might you look at?
I think one probably would be the feeling good about yourself.
Okay, so that's again another internal motivation. How do we maintain that motivation when we're learning? It's obviously a very important factor. If you're not motivated, you're probably going to have some trouble trying to keep up your interest and reach your goals. How do you maintain that? If you're in a really, and you're in a situation where maybe you're in a boring class and you're not really connecting with the person that's teaching the class and things aren't going very well and maybe you get a bad grade on the first assignment, what do? How do you change that? What sorts of things might encourage you to change your mind about that class and be more motivated? Any ideas?
You have to look at your progress. Like even if you got a bad grade, you have more knowledge than you did at the beginning. And the more that you go to class, the more that you learn, the more progress you're going to make. So you're obviously going to learn to keep going.
So you've got kind of a progress orientation and you're looking at steps that will help you make further progress. That's a good way to do it. Okay. Any other things you can think about?
It might be useful if you can connect the knowledge in some way to yourself or your own worldview.
Okay, so some sort of connection to your real life, somehow making it relevant, somehow having an authentic kind of learning situation. Of course, you're not setting that up. If you're in a class where that isn't happening, you have to kind of build that. And you have to think about how you might build that. But it's something that the more goal-directed that you can be and the more that you can try to figure out a way that being successful in that class has some sort of value to you, then the more likely it is you're going to be able to be motivated, and that motivation can help you to be successful. So that's kind of a brief view where you have to be very concerned with motivation. Another kind of issue that we want to think about is that for most complex knowledge and skills, it's not enough in many cases to just learn a set of facts or a set of skills. We have to be able to put all those things together in a really complex way. And I'm going to pick on Sean here because Sean actually is a good example of one of those kinds of things. Sean knows how to play the piano and play the organ, okay? And so there's a lot of kind of basic knowledge that's part of that. She has to know the notes on the page. She has to know how they're connected to the keys. She also has to know, and she probably can do better at this, tell me what she has to know then in terms of how to play the different things and the different musical keys and things like that. But she has to integrate all of that knowledge that's in her head and in her hands to put that together to play a musical piece. And she can probably tell you the first time that she plays a piece, it's probably not perfect. She has to integrate that. She's got to put that all together. So, and it's the same thing with the other kinds of things that we learn. We're not automatically going to be able to put it together right off the bat. We're going to learn these basic kind of knowledge pieces and concepts. We're going to learn maybe some basic skills in the lab, for example, in science. But in order to really be successful, we've got to have an ability to put all those things together, and it's going to take practice in order to do that. And so that integration of knowledge and skills and when to apply certain types of knowledge, that's something that is going to take practice. It doesn't happen automatically. And so that's something that people need to be aware of. So that's kind of the fourth principle, is that in order to develop kind of mastery of a particular field, we have to be able to integrate our knowledge and our skills in those kinds of areas. Go ahead.
Is learning just in the mind, like with the piano, could it like muscle memory, like in the fingers? And like
there's definitely some muscle memory there. So learning can occur. It's not just thinking, it's behavior as well. So go back to that kind of basic definition. Those muscle skills are a learned behavior.
And how do you change that?
How do you change that? Through practice.
Through the experience?
Yeah, through experience, through practice. That's kind of the next big thing that we're going to get to, is the need for practice. But yes, learning doesn't involve just thinking. There's learned behaviors, learned muscle practices. If you think about somebody who's a skilled athlete, for example, they have a lot of practice, a lot of learning that goes into developing those skills. Okay, so learning is not just about the head. Does that make sense? Yes. That's a good question, though, because I think in a lot of skilled behaviors, there's a combination of that conceptual knowledge in the head and some muscle knowledge. You think about a surgeon who has to perform surgery. He's got to not only have all the knowledge of those organs and systems in the body, but he's got to have that skill to actually control what he's doing or she's doing when they're performing surgery. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So the next big principle that we want to talk about is the concept of practice. We've kind of led to it a little bit with the concept beforehand, but what we want to do is to think about practice in a way that lets us think about what kinds of practice work and what kinds of practice don't work so well. Okay. One article that I read or book that I read talked about the difference between an expert and a novice as being a difference primarily in terms of the amount of practice. And I think it was something like, I can't remember, it was 10,000 hours or 20,000 hours that you had to do to become an expert in any particular area. But one thing to realize is that if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, you're not necessarily getting up to that skilled level of behavior. So it's not just practice, it's a certain kind of practice that you need to be using. If Sean was to keep playing scales over and over and over again, she probably would not develop her piano playing ability much further than it was. She probably had to practice some other kinds of things, okay? Similarly, if you were trying to learn concepts in a class, if all that you did was try to remember that list of definitions at the end of the chapter over and over and over again, you're not going to get very far towards a deeper knowledge of that material, right? So what you have to think about is not just practice, but practice that leads you to your bigger goals. So you have to think about developing goals for practice and trying to progressively move forward to higher goals. And we can think about examples probably in art in terms of using different techniques. If I'm going to practice If I keep using the same technique over and over again, I'm not going to develop any new skills. So I have to set goals, and I have to progressively reach those goals through my practice. And if I'm an instructor, what I want to be able to do is to give feedback to people that helps them to reach those goals, helps them to understand what that feedback, what that goal is, how the practice has helped them reach, has helped them progress towards that goal, has helped them move just a little bit further. And as an instructor, maybe I want to be able to set practice opportunities to help students move just a little bit further towards those goals. So,
like homework?
Like homework, exactly. So there's different kinds of assignments in that case that would help them. So again, it's not just practice, it's that practice has to be goal-directed, has to progressively move the person forward. If I just practice the same thing over and over again, I'm not going to get very far, okay? Go ahead, Shafiq.
I was wondering whether the practice, I know practice has a whole lot of value, but does it have some kind of limitations also? Like, for example, the question that I have, do you think that practice can make someone a critical thinker or a great synthesizer?
I think
this practice?
It depends on the kind of practice, okay? So what you would want to do in that case, and Shafiq is asking, how could you make somebody a critical thinker? How could you help people to synthesize things?
Whether practice can help.
Can practice help with that kind of thing? I think that in that kind of case, what you would have to do is you'd have to set up the opportunity to show them, to demonstrate what you want them to do and give them an opportunity to practice with new settings. They don't automatically make that connection. People have a really hard time doing that. In fact, you can give them examples, and sometimes even if you show them an example that's very similar, unless you point out that similarity, they don't see it. But what you want to do is let them know what the goal is, start them out with very simple things, and have them progressively move to more difficult. But the idea is they need to see, in some cases, some successful examples of what you want them to do. And that's one thing that you want to kind of make sure is part of their experience. Does that make sense? You might not get all of them there, but you should at least be able to see progress. If you have goals, you show them examples of what those goals are, and you give them opportunities to reach that with the right kind of feedback. Okay, all right. The next kind of principle that I want to talk about has to do with where people are in terms of their general level of development. Generally, when we're looking at college, we're looking at students who might be traditional college age, who might not be traditional college age. And what happens in the learning situations in the classroom is not independent of that, things that are going on elsewhere in their lives. So if you think about students at that age level, between about 18 to 22, and I'm going to pick on Nathan for a minute because he's my psychologist in the room. What do we know about what's going on with those people in terms of development? What would we want to say about what they're trying to do in their lives and where they might be developmentally?
Well, you see that first step towards independence.
Okay.
Outside of the home and forming a personal identity and establishing themselves in the world.
Okay. So independence, identity, those kinds of things. What else might be going on? I'm guessing Francis could probably help me a little bit with this one too. What's going on with students in terms of development, in terms of college students, where they are developmentally?
What's going on with them?
Yeah, in the classroom or otherwise in college.
Well, and of course it depends on their level. You know, our first year students are obviously at a lower level of development, and they need our assistance to get, as you were saying, with practice or, you know, with experiences to get where we want them to be. And they definitely need to start there to go up. You know, but then if you look at my tutors, they're definitely at a different place.
Okay.
Developmentally, and are continually always striving to do more.
All right.
I guess, okay, sorry, I was distracting here.
No, no.
I guess I just kind of have an argument for it because I guess I feel like you can practice, and I would say us tutors probably study a lot more than the average college student,
Right.
but none of us are really Einsteins, and I guess I just believe that you can practice, but if practicing allowed you to be some genius or this intense critical thinker, I guess, or a synthesizer, or you know, learning is behavioral as well. So Michael Jordan, I don't know, I think there would be a lot more of those in the world if it simply only took practice.
You're right. I think practice doesn't do everything, especially when you're talking about physical skill like that. You might never get to the point where you're at a Michael Jordan level. There are some boundaries there. You're right.
I mean, and mentally, I guess I think that people are born with the talent and you can practice, but it doesn't necessarily,
Okay.
you know, you can't, in my opinion, really achieve more than the talent that you have.
Okay. But can you achieve something? I mean, I guess this is one of the big debates. I mean,
your potential.
Yes.
Potentials may be different, but you don't know what it is until you get there.
but then the question is your achievement level fixed, or is there some range that you can move around in? And I think some people get into that mode where if they believe that, for example, I just can't do any better than this, that's a demotivating kind of thing. If they believe that that's a fixed capability, that demotivates them, that stops them. So you want to have them have an idea that at least they should be improvement motivated. But I can see what you're saying. You know, if you're talking about you know, somebody becoming a Michael Jordan, there is a certain level of skill that you can't move beyond. So that makes perfect sense. Yes.
That goes back to when you're talking about goal setting, you know, that you have to set your goals that are achievable.
They want to be realistic, exactly. And when you get to that, you have to figure out what a realistic goal is. It's not realistic for most of us to be Michael Jordan. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
I heard a study on, and you know this better than I would, but I heard a study on the radio the other day where they were looking at children in poorer neighborhoods, and all they really had to do to these children is just constantly say, you can do better. I mean,
Right,
you are
exactly.
smart enough, you can do better. So I think sometimes we kind of limit ourselves too, thinking that, I mean, yeah, we're not going to be Einsteins, but we can be something that's going to be important. We can do something that's useful, and that's what you're striving for.
To focus on effort and change makes the possibility of improvement possible. To focus on, I have this innate capability and I can't do any better, that kind of is a demotivating kind of thing. I think Charles wanted to say something.
To follow up on that, do we see then cultures or societies that there's a difference in that orientation that seems to impact that boundary in some way?
That's a good question.
Well, it might suggest that a collectivist culture, you would go towards more the group norm, where they're trying to be the standout person. So that may, those type of cultures might limit, you know, that exceptional person from going outside of the group norm.
Well, in a collectivist culture, I would think where you would be focused on is the good of the group, right. And whatever my achievements are, they go towards the good of that group.
Well, we need to be cautious, like to generalize. Because
yes, you're right.
I was reading something, I think it's a book, or a presentation by Malcolm Maxwell.
Yes.
And he kind of compared the achievements of US students and South Korean students, particularly math, science, and all those kind of things. And the distinctions that he made is that in US culture, it is kind of a, what is his word, that capability-based orientation, meaning that teacher probably will classify students in terms of their capability.
Right.
Whereas in South Korea, culturally, teachers are much more oriented to classify students who actually wants to work hard as opposed to who do not like to work that hard.
Right.
And so hard work is a dividing factor there, you know what I'm saying?
Okay, so they could classify either in terms of abilities or in terms of effort, in a sense.
So even though that's a collectivist culture, and I see your point that they might not try to achieve to be the single most important person in the group, but because of that hard work mentality, they might actually outperform other group members.
And I think, you know, if you look at the work on mindset, for example, and how people make attributions about success or failure, the idea that if you see it as something that's changeable, that if I work hard enough, I can do better, that's more likely to lead to better achievement and better learning.
Yeah, so that's a cultural thing, even though that's a collectivistic culture, but that's another layer.
Yeah, oh, certainly, and not all collectivist cultures are the same with that regard either. And you might have individual schools that would operate differently within a culture.
Yeah, and empirically, you can say that, you know, they are particularly in the math and science schools.
Yes.
Way higher than definitely this US scores and some of the Europeans also.
There's definitely some focus on math and sciences in some of those cultures as well. Yeah.
Medina in the book Brain Rules talks about if you keep telling a child that, oh, you did that, you're so smart, you're so smart, you're so smart, the children will have this preconception that they're very smart, but when they can't do something, they just think that they can't do it because they're not that smart. But if you keep saying to a child, you work so hard and that's why you're getting these wonderful grades, when a child doesn't make that great grade or they don't do something well, they think, well, I have to work harder. And I think that's sometimes the misconception that we give children is that everything that they do is based on their innate ability and not based on really how hard they work and, you know, how much they practice.
I always found that one of the joys of teaching college students that are in the traditional age frame is that as they're developing, they're discovering things about themselves that they didn't know before. And that college is this wonderful opportunity to discover that the hard work really does have payoffs, or to discover a talent that hadn't been nurtured before, but suddenly in a new environment, it blossomed. And that they might think thoughts that were appropriate and that were neat and that were wonderful and that opened their world. And that's the beauty of the traditional college age. And so having assignments and things that allow people to learn about themselves and to grow up through that stage. Because we're all stuck in developmental stages, no matter what age we are. Apparently, we are subjects of study by developmental psychologists. And there's good things about each of our stages, and there's wonderful things about the 18 to 22-year-old set.
Well, and I think, you know, from a learning perspective, what the focus is to realize that people are in these developmental stages, that, you know, your class that you're teaching, that you want them to learn something in, is not the only thing going on in their lives. They're developing identities, they're developing relationships, they're struggling with dorm life. There's all kinds of things going on that might impact how they are involved in the learning situation. And it does definitely kind of have some consequences for how well they can learn in some cases. All right. The last kind of principle, and I'll kind of review these at the end, but the last kind of principle has to do with the idea that we need to focus on, when we're trying to learn something, being a self-directed learner. And essentially what that means is that we need to have ways to monitor for ourselves when we've learned something, whether we've done enough, whether we've achieved our goals. Because that seems to be a stumbling block that many people hit on. They don't understand what they have to do to learn. They don't understand the processes that take place. They don't understand the strategies that they might need to use to actually learn something better than they did. I was talking to someone the other day, and they told me about a student that had read the chapter in the book 4 times. Well, and then they still failed the test. Okay, well, okay, what are you doing when you read the chapter? Are you really learning that chapter? How do you know that you're learning that chapter? What are the processes that you need to do to learn? So what are some things that you might do to try to determine whether you've learned something that you're trying to learn? Suppose that you're reading a chapter for a class, or you're reading a book, or you're trying to teach yourself how to fix something. How would you decide whether you've learned that or not? Should pick on the students in the room.
Summarize the important parts.
Okay, so you might read a section and then try to come up with a summary. Do you write that down? Do you tell it to yourself? Do you just say it inside your head?
Yeah, inside your head is the easiest to do.
Okay. Inside your head, do you let yourself get away with anything? I guess that's the question, because if, you know, I could read that and I could say, yeah, I got that. I don't need to do anything else, right?
Well, if you're having a a lot of trouble coming up with these important parts of that when I read it, so.
Okay.
It kind of depends
So to go back, all right.
you know in your own mind how well you've learned something just right after you read it, if you can't even pull any important parts out.
Okay. What else do you do to try to determine whether you've learned something? Any other strategies you use?
Ask somebody that knows.
Ask somebody that knows? Okay. How would they determine whether you had learned something?
I guess by questioning you.
Okay, so they might question you. I mean, you might work with a partner and they might quiz you, and then whether or not the two of you could answer those questions. It's sometimes easier to let yourself off the hook than, for a partner to let you off the hook, so that's one way to do it. One way that you might do is, okay, I read a chapter, and then what I do is I look at kind of the main headings of those chapters, and I say, okay, here's just the headings. What can I fill in under those headings? What else is that related to? If I can't fill anything in, that means I need to do something else, okay? But the idea is that you need to be able to self-assess. You shouldn't get to the test and discover that you have not adequately learned the material. That's not a very good place to be if you've ever taken a test and realized that you had no idea how to complete it. You want to be able to get to that point before you get to the test, so that while you're studying or while you're trying to learn, to come up with these strategies, to come up with different strategies for how to learn things, not just memorizing, not just terms, but thinking about how to build those deep knowledge structures, how to integrate material. Those are things that you would want to kind of focus on in those cases. So Sean told me to keep this to about a half an hour, and I've already gone longer than that. What I want to do is just to give you the list of the 7 principles. We've kind of talked around them, but I want to make sure that you have that list. Basically, the first principle is that prior knowledge can either help or hinder learning. That the organization of knowledge influenced how we learn and how we apply what we know. That motivation determines, directs, and sustains what we do to learn. To develop mastery, this is number 4, we must acquire component skills, practice integrating them, and know when to apply what we've learned. Number 5, goal-directed practice coupled with targeted feedback enhances the quality of learning. Number 6, the current level of development interacts with the social, emotional, and intellectual climate of the learning situation in ways that impact learning. And number 7, to become self-directed learners, we must learn to monitor and adjust our approaches to learning. So those are kind of the 7 basic principles. We've kind of talked around them a little bit. One thing to remember is that it's important, you can apply them in classroom settings and college settings, but you can also apply them in everyday learning situations. Just want to kind of open it up, questions, comments, things that people want to talk about related.
A couple people want you to repeat those because they're taking notes.
You know what I can do? I have a front page here that could be torn off and passed around.
Okay.
We don't need the
I'll do
other
that.
pages.
I'll do that and pass it for you. Who wants one?
Here's another one. We don't need all the other pages. Here's another one. And I can send them to anyone, email or...
I think electronically, if you email the group, actually that will be wonderful,
I was kind of, I don't know how to phrase it, but do you think there are some things that the human intellect cannot comprehend through learning, and we try too hard to achieve the knowledge?
Do you have some ideas about what they would be, or?
Well, pretty much just conception, birth. There's so much into cloning, and then there's the ethicality behind that type of That's just something that came to mind.
That's a good question, because you're bringing into, okay, scientifically, we can talk about what happens with conception. We can talk about what happens with birth, but then when we bring in that ethical question, that's a whole another dimension, right? So cloning and abortion, there's a number of ethical issues that brings up. And the question is, you know, where is there a limit to what our learning should be, I think, is the question you're trying to get at. Is there a limit to our learning? Is there a limit to science? Are there questions we shouldn't answer? Is that what you mean? Or
Limit's a good word to term, you know.
okay. What do we think? I'm going to put that out to the group. What do you think?
What is the question again? Sorry, I didn't follow that.
I guess I was just curious because we're learning about how to learn, so I was wondering, like, is there things that we are not capable of learning, but we strive to achieve that? And the example was just kind of like scientists creating life, or like the nature of cloning towards the ethicality of that.
So are there limits to what we could or should learn, I think is what you're trying to say.
Yes.
Is that, I mean, I don't know if that's, what do you think?
Well, see, when we're learning, we may be learning about something without knowing. Because there's a difference between learning and knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah, because like, you know, some questions about like the nature of cloning and ethics behind it, there may be some things that we don't know for certain that may not be objectively capable of knowledge because of the nature of the thing, but we can still learn how to ask questions, how to explore the issue from multiple perspectives, and then come to terms with the limits of our knowledge. And so we can learn how to say, well, I don't know for sure. And that's a type of learning and accepting the limits and boundaries of our intellect. Does that help?
Very well.
To take that a step further, I think there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. The
That is
wisdom
a good
takes
question.
experience along with the knowledge. So if you're asking questions like, what's the ethical issues behind this, that's going to take a little bit more than just knowing A, B, and C. It's also being able to put that together in some kind of framework and make it make sense.
So wisdom is different from knowledge in that you're adding maybe the experience and ideas about when to apply that knowledge.
Something along those lines.
And that might bring in ethics.
I was reading, I forgot the title, is a book by David Brooks, and basically what he was, the point that he was trying to make, that also our emotion, affection needs to be brought into the whole equation of learning.
Okay.
I can know all the facts and everything, but if I just don't feel for
Yes.
people like you, then
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have not learned anything.
So the emotional or affective aspects of learning and the development concept plays into that a little
And I
bit,
think
but
to answer her question also, and I don't know the definite answer. I think that's part of learning. This learning is culture-based, time-based. So at some point historically, I think people were not allowed to learn anything. Only those clergy, they were, the knowledge was not. You were not allowed to learn anything, because of that time. But let's see whether if I can just ask one question particularly. I know now that we live that developmental stage, that 18, 20 years old, they grow up with social media and everything. And recently I was reading a book called Too Big to Learn or something. And basically the author made an argument that now with social media and everything, hard facts are not hard facts. It is very difficult to differentiate between what is fact and what is not. So in that environment, how to actually address that as faculty member, that there are some things called facts.
so what's information and what's knowledge, and there's so much out there. How do you decide what's real?
This
What's
group,
true?
Maybe some 18, 20-year-old can help me. Sometimes it's very difficult for them to know what is fact and what is not because of social media, everything.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because you could go put out there anything, and that's happened in the past few weeks.
I know an exercise that I've done in class is for students to trace an idea back to until they get a concrete, irrefutable example, that they can hold up, that they know to be true, rather than, somebody's opinion, that they have to trace that idea back.
So identifying what's a valid source?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I was about to say,
part of that too is knowing whether something comes from a valid source or not. It's the same thing, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have to deal with, go digging through libraries, you know, we just can access the information faster. You know, anybody can pull up something on Wikipedia and change it as much as you want, but, you know, if it's from a reliable source like a scholarly journal or something like that, then, I mean, you can pretty much count on that information to be reliable.
Yeah, I don't want to sound too difficult or something, but what is reliable? The whole idea of reliable source has also changed, you know. So a blogger, you know, who I don't know, but you know, is it reliable?
I would say probably not. I mean, unless there's some kind of something to back up the blogger's claim, some tangible kind of information, I wouldn't really trust what a blogger would say, because I'm sure 90% of it is opinion anyway.
I think what happens to us over time is our facts become so politicized that I can find a journal article that says one thing and a journal article that says the other thing. And unless you're really kind of an expert in the field, you may not know that this journal article is really not that reliable. It's not a reliable place.
Right, and I'm sure you know, a lot of it is a matter of perspective too.
Could we kind of, rather than just focusing on the students learning, you mentioned wisdom and knowledge, and there's a couple elder citizens in here. Can you kind of express your experience with your life and learning, if you're willing?
You've got so much more to learn now than we ever had any thoughts.
I'll agree with that. Just in the last 10 years or so, it's been crazy.
Any other questions? I didn't mean to rush you through that, Mary Jo.
No. That's good.
I'd just like to put in a plug for the information literacy movement here, which is, I would really take exception to the concept that you can rely on reliable sources to be reliable. So do I'm wearing this t-shirt tonight. And I would not assume that anything is a reliable source. I don't care whether it comes from your government, from your church, or from any source. The whole concept of information literacy is you don't assume that anything is necessarily valid just because of the source. Because you've got to recognize that every source has their own inherent biases. So
it's true.
I thought it was just appropriate to say that, and I'll shut up.
On behalf of Milton Wolfe, one of his favorite sayings was, data, data everywhere, and not a thought to think. So that's kind of the same.
And
He would have
also,
enjoyed this tonight.
And also, he thought it was his duty to make sure that there was something in this library that would offend everyone.
That's good.
Any more questions? Thank you, Mary Jo.